Okay, so for a comprehensive list of events offered this month, please visit Geneseo's events calendar for Black History Month that I'm going to go ahead and provide in the chat. Okay, so before we begin, we ask that our participants mute your mics during the presentation. We do, however, highly encourage you to use the chat feature to provide questions to the presenter. We have a lot of time at the end for a Q&A. So we ask that all questions and comments are grounded in respect, first and foremost. No disrespect towards the presenter, moderator, or other participants will be tolerated. We reserve the right to remove participants if these expectations are violated. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Melanie Medeiros. Melanie Medeiros is an associate professor of anthropology. In addition to teaching for the anthropology department, Dr. Medeiros teaches courses for the socio-medical sciences, Black studies, women's and gender studies, Latin American and Caribbean studies, and Native American studies programs. She is the coordinator of the socio-medical sciences major and minor. Dr. Medeiros is the author of the book, Marriage, Divorce, and Distress in Northeast Brazil, Black Women's Perspectives on Love, Respect, and Kinship. Melanie, we are thrilled to have you share your expertise with us today. So without further ado, I'll hand this over to you. You're muted right now.
Yep, Zoom just told me. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Amanda, for the introduction, and thank you, Dave Parfit, for inviting me to speak today. I feel overwhelmed by how many people have shown up for this presentation, and it gives me a lot of hope that we can work towards becoming an anti-racist college and institution if everyone keeps showing up, right, as the semester gets busy, that we keep attending all these workshops and learn from each other. So I want to preface my presentation with a couple of points. First is that I am giving a baseline introduction to this idea of race as a social and cultural construction. So for those of you who are already coming in with background on this topic, this is going to feel a little superficial and brief. So just bear with me. And for those of you who have no baseline information, hopefully you'll take away some new knowledge from the presentation. The second thing I want to note is that I'm a cultural anthropologist. My research is on racism, health disparities related to racial inequality. It is not on biology, genetics, epigenetics, etc. I'm not a biological anthropologist. There are biological anthropologists who focus on human biology, and I'm not one of them. So in my discussion as race as a biological myth, I'm really trying to just highlight how we've come to assume that differences we see in groups of people are related to genetic differences, when really it's a social and culturally constructed category. Race is a socially and culturally constructed category. Okay, so with that, I am going to move over into, I hate to admit it, but a PowerPoint presentation, because that's just how I roll as a faculty member. So just give me 1 second here. Great. Awesome. And you should all be able to see that. Somebody, Amanda, can you raise your hand if you can't see the PowerPoint? You can see it. Okay, great. So when we think about race as a category, because that's essentially what it is, it's a social category. The idea of race as a category originated as early as the colonial period and continued to be salient as a biological category into the 20th century. And really, race as a category emerged when Europeans wanted to colonize other parts of the world and wanted to kind of explain the differences, the physical differences they were seeing among themselves, between themselves and people in other parts of the world, but also the what we would now call cultural differences, lifestyle differences, etc. So they developed this theory, and I should also, one of my prefaces should have been that as an anthropologist, I want to own the legacy that anthropology has played in race be developing as a category, in a problematic social category. So anthropologists were participated with colonial powers and collaborated with them to develop a theory of social evolution that categorized people as savage, barbarians, or civilized. Okay, so anthropology historically has a legacy of being complacent in the construction of race and in the mistreatment of people who have been deemed non-European races. Okay. And I think that, over the last probably 30, 40 years, the discipline has really come around to making a huge and significant effort to address its historical legacy. So with that, when I talk about these efforts of creating race as a category, I want us to recognize that anthropologists were part of this, especially through the social evolution theory. So what did social evolution theory allow for, and the creation of race as a category allow for? It allowed for the poor treatment of indigenous inhabitants of colonies and slaves. It allowed for their exploitation by arguing that these people were somehow inferior to Europeans, that they were genetically different, right? That they were not part of the same species even as Europeans. They were able to justify what we now know is the tragic legacy of colonialism and slavery. So these claims, as we get into the late 19th and early 20th century, were really supported. These claims about racial difference were really making false claims about significant genotypic differences between people who are actually phenotypically different. So genotype are the genes the person carries, but all human beings share about 99.9% identical DNA. So we are not actually significantly genetically different. And when race emerged as a category, it was with this assumption and this claim that we were significantly genetically different. Phenotypes are how genes are expressed. So this includes hair color, texture, skin color, etc., and a wide range of traits, heights. But specifically hair color, texture, skin color were used to justify the notion that there were biological racial differences, when really they were conflating phenotypic differences with genotypic differences. Okay, so really what was happening is that we were encountering, or the Europeans were encountering, people with different phenotypic traits, and then manipulating that information and saying, well, these are people are genetically different from us, significantly genetically different from us. So Nina Jablonski's research is among many researchers, but she's an anthropologist who's looked at skin color as an evolutionary adaptation to sun and vitamin D exposure. So it's one of the examples of how we can see how phenotypic traits have changed and evolved to adapt to climate and environment, but not so much as a signifier of significant genetic difference. Okay. So within this history of the categorization of race, there were these assumptions made that phenotypic traits and skills such as athletic prowess, intelligence, pain tolerance, etc., were linked, so that people with certain phenotypic traits would therefore be more or less intelligent, more or less pain tolerant. Okay. Remarkably, studies now of and I, as a medical anthropologist, I focus a lot on the healthcare system, among healthcare providers, found that a lot of healthcare providers buy into a link between phenotypic traits and certain actual characteristics. So for example, Americans of African descent, Black Americans, are less likely to receive pain medication during treatment because providers assume that they have a higher pain tolerance. Okay. So there is this legacy about assumptions about phenotypic traits and other forms of traits and characteristics that continues until this day and is problematic. So one of the questions that I sometimes get is, if we're not saying that there's significant genotypic differences between people who phenotypically look different, then how do you explain genetic diseases such as the sickle cell disease? So sickle cell disease is often labeled as a quote unquote Black disease. And this originated in the mid 20th century. So sickle cell disease was discovered in 1917. And leading up into the mid 20th century, research on it focused on Black Americans contracting sickle cell and started to argue that Black Americans have sickle cell anemia. This is an example of why race is a biological category, that there is significant genetic differences between people. So it became a totem of race, a proof that race was natural. And this, of course, emerged during movements against segregation, right, in the start of the civil rights movement. In all actuality, sickle cell disease occurs among people who are the descendants of people who lived in regions that had high rates of malaria. So sickle cell disease is an adaptation to malaria. And so this occurs in West Africa, the Mediterranean, Southern India, and South America. You see people with sickle cell disease. But in the United States, it was kind of labeled and categorized as a quote unquote Black disease in order to contribute to movements movements to maintain segregation and to maintain this idea that there was significant difference between people who were labeled as being of different races. Okay. This is not just the case of sickle cell disease. We see this with Tay-Sachs disease and other diseases as well. Okay. And again, I'll just point out that this is another issue within the medical healthcare system, that these kind of misunderstandings happen because it's not part of medical training to distinguish between geographic differences in predisposition and an actual significant genetic differences. So now that I gave you that super kind of brief, superficial, why we can't think of race as being a significantly biological category, I want to focus more on what my expertise is in, and that is more the sociocultural construction of race. So I'm referring to the sociocultural construction of race because we can often say the social construction of race or the cultural construction of race. As a culture anthropologist, I recognize the ways that it's both social and cultural, and I'm not going to go into the difference right now. So we're just going to combine those two terms into sociocultural. So race, as defined by contemporary cultural anthropologists, is the grouping of human beings based on the presumption, but not the reality, that significant genetic differences separate people into distinct populations. Okay. So again, that presumption, but not the reality, right? And here's the thing now, even though we're aware now that race is not a significant biological category, the legacy of categorizing and dividing people into different racial groups persists. And this is why we continue to have conversations about race, not because of its legitimate biological underpinnings, but because it is become such a salient social category that we can't ignore it. We can't just not talk about it. And you all know that because you're here. So how people are grouped into racial categories is socioculturally specific. And as a cultural anthropologist, one of the things that I focused on is how race is socially constructed in other places outside the US. But I like to offer the US as a basis for our discussion. So the construction of the race in the US is really relies heavily on the idea of hypodescent, the one drop rule. Hypodescent used to be a legal concept, and now it's a social ideology that permeates public perception. And what do I mean by that? I mean that historically, when it was a legal concept, anyone who was seen to even have a quote unquote one drop of blood that was not European, so any sort of phenotypic traits that may indicate that they were not European, would be considered to be Black and subject to the discriminatory policies that Black people were subjected to. Even though this is not a legal idea, Americans continue to think of race, majority of Americans continue to think of race in terms of this one drop, meaning that anyone who has a phenotypic traits outside of European descent is going to be called Black or brown or a person of color, right? Identified. And I think that President Obama is a great example of this. When he was elected, he was often always referred to as the first Black president because this is a significant achievement. Okay. And that is a very US based statement. In other countries, he may be considered to be a brown president because he has European features and features of someone from African descent because his parents come from different regional backgrounds, right? But in the US, we're going to be more prone to recognize him as being a Black president. Okay. It's been interesting for me to watch the coverage of Vice President Harris because I've noticed that the media has been doing a much more intentional job of identifying her different social identities, right? She's the first Black vice president. She's the first female vice president. She's the first Southeast Asian vice president, right? So they're going in and they're really identifying the unique parts of her identity. And I am sure that is because her team has made that so, right? They've made a lot of effort to kind of combat the one drop rules legacy in terms of how she's depicted to the public. The construction of race in the US is also really rigid. And again, this idea of the one drop rule, and it's also for a long time has been based in a system of people are white or people are Black. Okay. But this is constantly changing. And I think that the US Census categories offer us the best insight into understanding how racial categories in the United States have changed. So the US Census categories in the 3 decades between 1930 and 1960 had 2 options, white or Negro. And then by 1970, 1980, they recognized that some people identified as Black rather than Negro, right? And that Negro was derogatory. So they added white, Black, and then an other category in response to the fact that there were immigrants coming from other parts of the world. In 1990, it was white, Black, or Negro, and an other race. And then the 2000, 2010 categories had white, Black, or African American, some other race. And then they distinguish and say that people who have a Hispanic or Latinx identity, although they said Latino, that is an ethnic identity. It's a separate question. It is not a racial identity, right? So things are starting to get a little bit more complicated. I wanted to highlight the questions posed during the 2000 2010 census where they start to kind of try and distinguish between Hispanic, Latino, ethnicity, and then race. So first they ask, is this person Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish? And then they ask the person's race, right? And this is an attempt at addressing the fact that for a long time, Hispanic and Latinx has been considered to be a racial category when there is actually a lot of phenotypic diversity among people who identify as Latinx or Hispanic. So to make assumptions and say that all people who are Latinx and Hispanic are going to share the same racial identity is incorrect. So they're acknowledging that to some extent, okay? And they're recognizing that Latinx and Hispanic is considered to be an ethnicity. But then in turn, they continue to label, Chinese, Filipino, Korean, Japanese, these other different ethnic identities as a racial category. So there's still room for growth to address this. I feel like it's important when I'm making that statement to help you guys distinguish between race as a category and ethnicity as a category. So for anthropologists, ethnicity is not based in phenotypic traits, right? It's a sense of historical, cultural, and sometimes ancestral connection to a group of people who are imagined to be distinct from those outside the group, right? So it's about creating a group identity surrounding history, culture, often language, etc. So this is emphasis on history and culture versus phenotypic traits. Now, don't get me wrong, phenotypic traits often lead to assumptions about someone's ethnicity, right? But the two are not exactly the same. And yet, they often get grouped together. Okay, so if you look on the right here, this is a chart from the Pew Hispanic Center based on the US Census, and it combines race and ethnicity into one category. So you have Hispanic, which is more of an ethnic category now, and then white, Black, Asian as racial categories, and then, American Indian, Alaska Native. So it's again combining race and ethnicity in a way that makes it a little bit more difficult for people to understand the difference between them. Okay. And one of the best examples of this, I think, is to say that, having a Black racial identity does not mean that you have an African American ethnic identity. Right? So some people with Black racial identities may have an Afro-Caribbean, right, or an Afro-Latinx identity that is not an African American one. So one of my biggest critiques when I'm reading medical studies that are looking at racial disparities in health is when they use Black and African American interchangeably. And so then it's hard to pinpoint, are they doing studies of people who identify as African American, or are they doing studies of people who identify as Black and may come from many different subsets of the Black community in the United States? The 2020 census, I pulled this up for this presentation, is again changing, right? It's again trying to address. So under this racial category, they've started to ask people for their ethnic identities without necessarily explicitly saying ethnic identity. So you can label yourself as white, but then they want to know, do you see yourself as German, Irish, etc.? You can label yourself as Black, but then they want to know, are you Jamaican, Haitian, Nigerian, Ethiopian, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there is kind of headway being made to recognize this difference between race and ethnicity, even if it doesn't explicitly use the term ethnicity on this form. Why is this important for understanding the social and cultural construction of race? If race was somehow inherently biological, if it was a category with any sort of biological salience, you would not see that every 10 years the terms we use to refer to people and categorize people change, right? It is constantly in flux, which demonstrates to us that this is a constructed category. It's a constructed category that changes with social and cultural change. So to offer a comparison, I'll talk about the construction of race in Brazil. So in the Brazilian system is quite different from the US system. There are about 3 different category systems in Brazil. So you have census categories of Black, brown, white, indigenous, okay, and these correspond to colors, skin colors specifically. But Brazilians themselves use an informal system that includes over 100 racial identity labels. So they may refer to themselves as being light brown, medium brown, dark brown. There are, again, over 100 linguistic markers that people within the community understand what it means, right? So there's gonna be a term for somebody with, hair of someone of African descent, but the rest of their phenotypic traits are someone of European descent, will have a label, an identity label for that person. Okay. So it's much more of a spectrum. And then the third category is the one kind of employed by the Black social movement in Brazil. And it argues that we should be collapsing the categories of brown and Black so that we can have a Black category with a capital B that relates to a Black subjectivity and racial solidarity. And so that's why you'll see me use Black with a capital B in my presentations, and also refer to Brazilians of African descent as Black Brazilians, kind of in solidarity with the Black movement in Brazil. So the construction of race in Brazil, you have these 3 different systems and categories, but it really all indicates the fact that race in Brazil is a continuum. It combines not just phenotypic traits, not just the physical, but economic class, social relations, cultural differences, etc. So in Brazil, a person who um, is somebody with phenotypic traits of being someone from African descent who is upper class will not identify as being Black, right? They will have a different term that they use to describe themselves. So there's this idea that through physical practices, so through the way you look, but also through qualities such as class, style of dress, communication, education, profession, etc., that you can move within the racial continuum. There's a kind of a false notion of upward mobilization there. It is very difficult for working class Brazilians who have features of someone from the African descent to upward socially mobilize, right? But there's more wiggle room in terms of racial identity and how someone sees themselves than there is in the US, where the US has this very Black-white dichotomy that that often drives our understanding of race, okay? In Brazil, it's very fluid. So I just have a few more slides. I know I've been talking for a while and I would love to get to some questions. Hopefully I can answer them all. So I want to speak just really briefly now to the idea of race and identity. So again, like ethnicity, race is a socially constructed category, but it has a significant impact on people's identities. So especially for people from non-dominant racial groups, a person's identity is going to be more, racial identity is going to be more important to them than someone from a dominant group. So if somebody in the United States is primarily of European descent, okay, they may not see their identity as a white person as being as important to who they are as somebody who identifies as being Black, right? And it's because of their daily experiences. I'm not going to give a whole lecture on identity right now, but I just want to note that we can never assume someone's racial identity. Okay? And we have to understand that racial identity is going to be influenced by social and cultural processes as well. When we think about race and identity, and I included these slides as I think it's important since so many people here are professors, words matter. Okay, and I wanted to clarify, from an anthropological perspective, terms that I think are appropriate. And I'm sure there's a whole long list of other ones, but I often hear students refer to people as Caucasian. Caucasian is a term that, again, originated in our efforts, in race scientists' efforts to divide people into biological racial categories. So Caucasian is no longer an appropriate term to use to refer to white people because it is associated with this kind of biological difference, this significantly genetic difference that we now know doesn't exist. So saying white people is more appropriate. I often hear people say, well, whites and Blacks, as if the word white and Black is a noun rather than an adjective. So better is to use the term Black people and white people. Even better, people who identify as Black and people who identify as white, or people with a Black racial identity and people with a white racial identity. This specific language is allowing you to recognize in the words that you use the way that race is socially and culturally constructed, and the way it's socially and culturally constructed and influences identity, rather than it being an actual concrete category. And also very good are people who are racially marked as Black and people who are racially marked as white. And that means people who in a society are identified as being Black or white based on phenotypic traits. And then if you in Brazil, it's based on phenotypic traits, class, etc. So to wrap up, when we're thinking about race and biology today, I do want to come back to this idea of biological race is a myth, because race does influence biology, because it's a salient sociocultural category. It's a salient sociocultural category that has consequences for human health and therefore biology. So health inequality and inequity exist as a product of racism, social inequality, and structural inequity. And unfortunately, healthcare providers continue to be trained to think of racial health disparities as grounded in genetic predisposition rather than social determinants of health, such as social inequality. However, new research in epigenetics is starting to reveal the ways in which generations of marginalization and discrimination have had an epigenetic effect. Okay, so we're seeing this, especially in research on Black women's maternal mortality in the United States, where even highly successful um, women of African descent in the United States have high maternal mortality rates. And researchers are hypothesizing that this is due to generations of racial discrimination and inequality that has imprinted on the genes of the body. Okay, this is really new research. I think it's very important research. I think people often are afraid to talk about race in biology because they don't want to go back to the origins of race as a category, as a biological category. But I do think it's important to recognize that race as a sociocultural category does impact the body. Okay, so just to conclude, I think I basically made these statements just now. Race as a significant genetic category is no longer salient. It really was never, it should never have been salient. However, people who are marked as being non-white in the United States, also in Brazil, throughout the Americas, experience extreme forms of discrimination and social inequality. And that has had a lasting effect on the health of racialized groups, and studies indicate it's having an epigenetic effect. So, whew, that was a mouthful. Hopefully got all that. And I'm happy, I guess, to turn it over to questions.
So if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to either put something in the chat and I can read it out loud to Melanie, or unmute. Either way.
I should also note that, I was tasked with giving the introduction to this month and to focus on the social and cultural construction of race. And so I did not talk a lot about racism, right? Because other people are going to talk about that. But if we want to have, discussion related more to anti-racism and racism, feel free to ask questions about that as well.
Thank you very much, Melanie. I really appreciate this overview. I think it's very helpful and relates to some of the things that we've been reading in Kendi's Stamp from the Beginning, as far as this social construction of race. It was really interesting to me, the example you used from Brazil, how there are so many different subtle categories of race in that country. And I wonder if there are countries that are less segregated than our own, so race as a sociocultural category is certainly having effects on health of the body, perhaps more because of environmental effects, where people are growing up, et cetera. So in places that are less segregated than ours, are you seeing those impacts on health diminished?
So I should clarify that even though there's more racial fluidity in Brazil, the colorism and segregation is a huge issue in Brazil as well. So all the health disparities that I kind of mentioned in the US exist in Brazil. And this is the irony. For decades, in the 1930s, a Brazilian sociologist made the claim that because there was so much racial mixture in Brazil, there is no racism, and it's a racial democracy. But and then in the 1970s, Black scholars and activists started making a statement. No, that is not the case. We don't live in a racial democracy. There is extreme racism based on phenotypic traits combined with class, all the, so what goes into race is different, but the experiences of people who are racialized and marked as being Black are similar to the experiences in the US. And so one of the things I didn't talk about in my presentation, and when I teach about this, I do a whole other lecture on whiteness, because really what it comes down to is who is white, who has that white privilege, and then the marginalization of everyone else to support that. And so in Brazil, whiteness has the same privilege and power as in the US.
Thank you, Melanie. So I'm actually going to, we're getting some questions in the chat, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the recording now so that people feel a little bit more free to have, a free flowing discussion.